Welcome everybody. In this video I'm gonna talk about the SolidCP Installer so that you can get some understanding about the programming of the installer. The installer, we did quite a lot of the code is new, and because the old installer had a bad design, and also we need to support Linux and Mac OS, so we need to support different operating systems to install those. So quite a lot of the installer is new. And yes, so the installer is here in the SolidCP folder installer, and here we have this here is the old installer, SolidCP Installer and SolidCP Installer Core, and the SolidCP Universal Installer and all those projects here. This is the new installer. And also the setup project has changed. There is a legacy setup, that's the old installer, and the new setup, that's the new installer. So let's look at this new installer in Visual Studio. We have here quite a lot of projects because the installer uses functionality from the operating system providers and from the web providers, and so we import all those projects here. And so this one here is the program of the new installer, and here you see that the program, and it's starting the installer. But this project, it only calls methods from this universal installer core, and this universal what is it doing now? Rename. Oh my god, what did I do? Yes, you can always revert with Git. Okay, so using functionality from core, from this universal installer core, and here this is the heart of the functionality of the installer. So what we do, we have a base type installer. This is the base type, and it contains all the important methods we need to use to install stuff. And where is it defined? Here you can see it's this class, and then we have different flavors of the same class. It's a partial class, and for all the different web applications, we have different files with different methods. But this is also the installer class. It's all the installer class. All those methods are defined in the installer class. And then for different operating systems, we have classes that inherit from installer and implement specific virtual methods specific to specific operating systems. Like we have a Windows installer, and then a base class Unix installer for all the Unix installers, and then we have a bunch of installers here that inherit from Unix installer, like Kali, Fedora, Debian, CentOS, Arch, Alpine, and then there's also a Mac installer. And what the operating system specific installers do, they implement how to install the .NET 8 runtime, and yes, and the Windows installer. But the difference between Unix and Windows installer is the Unix installer has another install website method. The Windows installer uses system web management to install a website, And the Unix installer, in order to install a website, it uses a project ASP.NET Core shared server that allows to start Kestrel only on demand, so it saves some resources. And we can look at this. It's here. This is install ASP.NET Core shared server, and the next method is install website. It's here. Install website. And then install website first installs ASP.NET Core shared server, and then it configures an application for this ASP.NET shared server with listen URLs, and then it adds this application, and this is going to save the configuration for the ASP.NET Core shared server, and then it opens the firewall, and that's it. And the shared server, the ASP.NET Core shared server, we install as a service on Linux. And we do this here. First, we initialize the configuration of it. And then if the system Linux is a systemd Linux, we install a systemd service. And if it's OpenRC Linux as Alpine Linux, we install an OpenRC service, or if it's a Mac OS, then we install a launchd service. And then we call install service, and it's going to install this service. So that's how we install a website. And then it has other modules, this universal installer runtime. It's code that is specific to .NET Core, because universal installer core, it builds on .NET Standard. As you can see here, it's built on .NET Standard because it needs to run on .NET Framework as well as on .NET 8. So it's built on .NET Standard, and everything that cannot be implemented in .NET Standard, it's implemented here in Universal Runtime. And this builds against .NET 8 and .NET 4.8. And we have here the web service the installer web service that queries for available install packages. And then we have a load context implementation. This is because on the .NET framework, the installer first downloads the setup DLL, and then it calls the setup DLL inside a separate app domain. But on .NET 8 there is no app domain, there's only assembly load context, so this load context is for loading setup DLL in a separate assembly load context. And then, yeah, we have other stuff that is specific to .NET 8. And then there's the user interface of the installer. There's 3 different user interfaces. There's a WinForms user interface, and there's a console user interface, and there's an Avalonia user interface. The Avalonia user interface, it has not yet been implemented. It's just a dummy that can be implemented, but we had no time to implement the Avalonia user interface. The Avalonian user interface would be portable between Mac, Linux, and Windows. So it would be interesting to implement this, but at the moment we are using the console user interface on Linux. And the console user interface, it derives from an abstract user interface class. This is the abstract user interface class here, this UICS. It declares all the methods that the user interface must provide. And there's some basic methods. Some basic methods here. And then there's a setup wizard. And the setup wizard, it defines some methods that if you call those methods, then you in it is the setup wizard with pages. And so it has, for example, a page license agreement, a page server admin password, and different pages that the wizard contains, and we init the wizard by calling those methods. You can see this in the setup. The setup here, this is a DLL that gets downloaded and that needs to know how to install everything. And it gets, for example, if we choose to install Enterprise Server, then the installer will call this method here, Enterprise Server 2.0, and then it will either call install, update, setup, or uninstall. And this will call installer current enterprise server, install base installer setup. And this is defined here in base setup. Base setup. And if we look at base setup, it has here a method wizard. And this method will initialize the user interface setup wizard. And it will just create a new wizard and then an introduction page, check prerequisites page, and a license agreement page. And then if it's not a standalone installation of standalone server, it will ask for the install folder and for the web settings, and if we don't choose HTTPS for the web settings, it gets a warning that is an insecure connection. And then we ask for a certificate if we choose HTTPS and a website needs a certificate. And then the user account, and then the server password, if it's a server install, if it's enterprise server, it asks shows a database page and server admin password. And if it's web portal, it shows this page, enterprise server URL. And in the console UI, this implementation of this of the wizard of the setup wizard is rather straightforward. We have here a list of pages in the setup wizard, and it's just an action. And then if we call this method of the setup wizard introduction, it just adds this action to the pages, and later on the wizard just calls this action to show this console UI here. And for the console UI, we use this class console form, and it has the ability to show some console forms, and this is actually this class here. It's an API to show console forms. And how this works, we can have buttons here. Buttons are in those brackets, and if we put if we want to have some fields where we can enter text, then we can put a bracket with a question mark, and this will show a text field. And after the question mark is the name of the text field, so we can assign this text field here. First we assign console form to form, and then we can assign this text field here a text, or we can also access the text and save it after we have shown the dialog. Then we save the content of the form. And also, if this name here is found in the settings object, we don't have to set it manually. I can show an example for this. here, for example, username and password, it doesn't assign those values of the form directly. It just uses load settings. And if there's a field or a property in settings that has equal name as username or password, then those fields will automatically be loaded from this variable settings. And the exclamation mark, it means this is a password field. And if there's a percent sign, this means it's a progress bar. And there's some others, but I have to look into the code for this. This here in the parse method. If it's a star, an asterisk, then it's a default button, and we have question mark, and then if it's an X, just a one character input field with the X, this is a checkbox, a checkbox. And yes, that's the stuff it supports. Okay, and then we have the WinForms UI. This is actually just the old UI copied into a new project, and we didn't modify it a lot. The old UI, we just introduced new UI for this new stuff we implemented, like embedding enterprise server into web portal. And so this is still like in the old installer. It's all the wizard pages. And here's the WinForms UI that inherits from the abstract UI that defines a user interface. And we have here also the methods and also the wizard methods, the setup wizard methods. Yes. And so, yes. And we did test the installer on Ubuntu and on Fedora and on Alpine Linux, but maybe Alpine Linux still needs some testing. And we did not test on Mac OS because I don't have a Mac, and in order to test it on Mac OS, one would need a Hackintosh Hyper-V installation, but it's a little bit complicated to get it running, so I could not do this at the moment. So I could not test on the Mac OS, but it's everything implemented for Mac OS, but it is not tested. So probably it won't work, but it would be implemented. If someone has a Mac and wants to test the installer, feel free, and we will be happy if we don't have to do this ourselves. Okay, and then let's see how this looks. We can start the installer here. And this on the Windows, we can run the installer with .NET Framework or also with .NET 8. And on the Linux, we run it using .NET 8. And when we run on the Windows, we can use WinForms UI or the console UI. Okay, this takes quite some time. Yeah, it's building the code. And also in the old installer, there was a problem that it could not upgrade the web config files from old installations. And this has been addressed, I think, in Here in the installers, for example, enterprise server, update enterprise server, here update enterprise server config. If you look at this method, it will load the existing config file, and then it will correct the existing web config file to the newest version. For example, here it will delete all the Microsoft Web Services 3 parts that belong to VSE3, because the new version, it uses core VCF and not VSE3 and VCF on .NET Framework. And then it adds the web section for Swagger VCF. And so it automatically upgrades the web config file in this version of the installer. We need to run it. It's just, yes, I cannot start it because it needs administration rights. But let's start it from here. Universal installer bin. So we have two versions here, one version .NET 8, one version .NET 4.8. So let's stay with 4.8 for now. And it doesn't look different as the old installer. It looks just the same because the WinForms UI, it has just been copied. First, it starts with a console window, because it needs to be able to also run as a console application, not only WinForms application. And then, yes, now here that's the same user interface as we are used to. And so here is everything that we had. And for the web services that are needed by this installer, I can show you they are contained here in the SolidCP website. This has the web services needed for the installer, and these web services, they need a little bit of an upgrade compared to the old web services, because the feed, the products feed, it needs to specify if the platforms where we can install this component. And we can see this here in the data. If we look at the product releases feed, we have some new features in this feed. And here we can see this here is new: platforms, Windows, Unix. So this means that the standalone server setup, you can install it on Windows or on Unix. And if we go down here, we have the server component. The old product feed had two types of server components: server ASP.NET version 2 for .NET Framework 2, and this one, it only runs on Windows. If you omit this platforms tag in a feed, then this means this feed only works on Windows. And then we have this one here. This also only works on Windows. Actually, we should copy this to build this. This might be a bug that this is missing here on this server, that it should also contain this tag that it's only for Windows. So this server here, server ASP.NET v 4.5, it only is for Windows. And then we have a server component that's only for Unix. Here we can see it's only for Unix. So this is actually, it's the same file, SolidCP server zip, and here also SolidCP server zip, but we had to implement it that way. It's a separate feed because otherwise the old versions of this feed here, they only work on Windows. No, it's only to the version 2.0 that's working also on Unix, and the old versions only work on Windows. So we had to put the Windows version into this feed and the Unix version in this new feed here. That's called server and code server Unix. And then the upgrade of the installer, it's in this feed here. And as upgrade, no, there's two upgrade feeds. There is one for Windows here and one for Unix. And the Unix upgrade feed, it uses this installer file here, and this is basically the .NET 8 version of the installer. And this here, the old upgrade, is only the .NET 4.8 version of the installer. And so this is the code here, CFG Core Unix and CFG Core. This is for upgrading the installer. And then we have a new component here, setup2DLL. This is to improve the speed of downloading the installer, because the old installer, it always downloaded the full distributive package. And the new installer, first of all, it will only download the setup2DLL. The setup2DLL is specific to each version because it contains the code how to install all the stuff. So for every version, there's a setup2DLL, and before it was only called setupDLL. But because we changed the API, we renamed it to setup2DLL. And so the installer will first just download this setup2DLL, and then it will be able to all the instructions how to install the stuff, and then it will download also the full package containing also the distribution. Okay, so if we upgrade SolidCP to .NET Core, to the core VCF branch, we also need to upgrade the website with the web services. And in order to test this, probably one has to first just install the beta feed, the beta web service, or just install all the web services and just update the beta feed here. Just update this feed here, and keeping this so we don't break existing downloads of the installer. And if it's working in the beta feed, we can also upgrade the product releases feed. Because if we take this feed here in the new web services, it will just assume that everything only runs on Windows. It will just set this Windows header, the platform header, to Windows. We can see this here in the code, but it takes some time to open it. This would be here. Okay, we have here install server base, this code here. So this is the base class for all the web services, and it adds a platforms column to the data table compared to the old version of the web services, and it uses this platforms element, and if it's not defined, it uses the platforms element of the component. First, it uses the individual platforms element of the individual package, and then it uses the platforms element of the component, and if it's not present, it just uses Windows. And that means you can define this platform either on the component level, so that applies to all the releases, or you can apply this platforms element on the individual releases. Like for example here, like this. So, and if the platforms element is not found, then it just assumes it's only working for Windows, this component. Okay. Okay, so I think that's about it. And if someone has time and is in the mood to implement an Avalonia user interface for the installer, feel free to do it. I can show you what's present up to now for the Avalonia UI. Yes, one thing I need to mention is that the old installer, it just downloaded the setup DLL, but this was not always compatible, because the setup DLL did not download also its requisite DLLs. So if the setup DLL needed a DLL that was not present in the installer, then it would fail and you would have to upgrade the installer. So in order to address this, we use a library to embed all the needed, all the required DLLs from setup DLL to embed them in setup DLL. So it always is self-contained and independent of the DLLs present in Universal Installer, in the installer. So you don't have to upgrade the installer. And how we do it is we do this with Foodie, Costura Foodie. And this is a library to embed DLLs. So you can run the software as a standalone DLL, because all the needed DLLs are embedded. And this is what we do here. We import this package here, this NuGet package, portable Costura Foodie, and then also the package Foodie. And then we have a file to configure it, and we tell him here to exclude those assemblies. They should not be included. And if we build this, let's build it, then it will embed all the required DLLs. But this Costura Foodie, it had some shortcomings when it came to native DLLs. You have to rebuild it probably. When it came to native DLLs, it was not having all the features we needed, so we added some other DLLs that are just extracted on demand from the embedded resources, and those DLLs are in those folders here. We have just DLLs that will be always extracted, and then we have DLLs only for .NET Core, DLLs only for .NET Core and Unix, and DLLs for .NET Core and Windows, and DLLs for .NET Framework, and DLLs for .NET Framework Windows. And I believe you could also have a folder DLLs on .NET now, the .NET framework doesn't work on Linux now, so it's logical. It's only Windows. But it can run also on Mono. I think it's also working on Mono. The installer should also work on Mono. If you start the installer on Mono, you can start the .NET Framework version of the installer. It should work on Mono, but I'm not sure. I didn't test it recently, but in the beginning that wasn't the idea. It also runs on Mono. So if you have a Linux distribution and Mono installed, you should be able to run the .NET Framework version of the installer on Mono. Okay, so we are building now here this setup, and maybe it's server space. I'm not sure if it shows the Costura FUI messages, but if we don't have the settings to show the messages, but if you build it on MS Build in the command line, you see the messages of Costura FUI, how it embeds those assemblies. And also installer, universal installer, it also uses Costura FUI and also embeds all the DLLs it needs. So basically, in the end, it's just one DLL you need to start when you are starting universal installer. Everything is contained in the exe or in the DLL, in the main DLL. It also uses Costura FUI here, as we can see. And for this, we need an assembly loader that is smart and extracts those embedded DLLs from the embedded resources. And that's this code here, the assembly loader. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes, I talked about the Avalonia user interface. It's just a basic provider class that's that's inheriting from UI, from the base user interface abstraction class. And it also has a setup wizard, but actually the only thing implemented, it only throws exceptions, not implemented exception. That's all it does. And in order to implement an Avalonia UI, you would have clone this WinForms UI in Avalonia. And as I'm new to Avalonia, I didn't have time to do this. Yes, and it's also not really needed because the console UI it's working and it's okay. But it would be nice to have a graphical user interface also on Linux and on Mac OS, and this would also be portable. It would also work on Windows, so we wouldn't need a WinForms UI anymore. But I didn't have time to implement this because I would need to learn Avalonia first. But I think Avalonia is not too complicated to learn. It's similar to XAML. Okay. I forgot to mention something important. The settings file has changed. The format of the settings file has changed. In the old installer, the settings were stored in the app config, and in the new installer, the settings are stored in a JSON file. We can see this in the bin folder here. The settings in the new installer, they're all stored in this file here, installer settings JSON. And this is a JSON file, and it has sections for server, enterprise server, web portal, standalone web dev portal, and then a section for the installer. And here, installer, this installed components, it's all the components that are installed, but at the moment there's nothing installed. And then there is a web service URL. If you are testing the installer, you must enter the URL to the web services here. And this is actually a website that's hosting this websites project we have seen before. That's hosting actually this website here. So that would be this folder here. This folder you can host as a website, and then you need to specify the address to this as a folder. And this would be in my installation here in the local installation. It's localhost SolidCP Installer service, and that's a website that's running the installer website, and it's in the default website, and it's here, this website here, SolidCP Installer service. And if we look at the basic settings, the path is SolidCP website, sources SolidCP website. So that's this folder I've shown you before. And then services, install the service, either beta or without beta ASMX. This website service URL you have to specify, otherwise the installer will fail because the main website is not yet running. And then here are all the settings for the components, and actually those settings I forgot to mention, they are defined here in the settings class, and there's installer settings, and we have the specific package settings here in the installer settings, and then there's component settings, and that's settings specific to the server component, and then settings specific to enterprise server, and then settings specific to web portal, and settings specific to WebDAV and standalone settings. And then here's installer specific settings, and that contains the installed components, and also it can import the old configuration of the old installer, but I'm not sure if this is working yet. But I started implementing it, but I'm not sure if it's really working reliable to import the old settings of the old installer. If it will correctly import this, we need to test if this really works. And then here the web services URL I've shown you before. Yes. And the proxy settings. And then also, maybe I can explain this too. This is transactions. We made this class to support install transactions, and it actually it has a method with rollback, and it takes actions, a numerable of actions, so you can specify a single action or several actions that are executed upon rollback. And how this looks, if we can, let's look at some references to this. Find our references. How this looks in the code. Let's look for this one here. References for this one. So this is the code we would use. In the installer class, it implements a method transaction. So we make transaction, and then we have a lambda expression that's running the transaction, and if it fails, we specify with rollback, and it will remove and will undo. This code here will undo the above code of the transaction. So that's how we implement transactions. Yes, I think that's about it. We have here this we already explained, the different installers for the different operating systems. Yes. I've forgotten another thing to mention finally, that is unattended setup. And for unattended setup, I'm just about to implement this. It's not yet finished, but for unattended setup, you have to set in the installer settings, in the installer settings JSON, you have to set this value here, unattended install packages, and you have to specify an action what to do with these install packages, and this is just install or uninstall or setup or update. And then you specify a comma separated list of names of install packages, and then they will be installed unattendedly as soon as this is working. And in the installer settings, you just would have write it like this: the action would be install, and unattended install packages you would just specify with a comma or a semicolon separated list what packages you want to install. One final word. To the unattended install, we have shown that you can set this attribute here in the installer settings JSONs. You can set this attribute in the installer settings like so, and then you can specify a comma separated list of applications you want to install unattendedly like this. But you can also do this on the command line, and we're gonna look at this on the command line here in the launch settings. You can specify this unattended and then the same list of applications, and you can also specify an install action like install or uninstall or setup or I forgot the last value, setup or here's the values: updates, install, uninstall, update, or setup. But this value here is optional. The default is, if you omit this value, the default is install. You can also like this, and then if you run universal installer, it will go into unattended install mode. Okay, thanks for watching.